Okay, I want to go back over and be clear on who the Democrats' demographically strongest supporters are. Then we're going to look at shifts and trends in voting for Democrats versus the Republicans, and then we're going to look at the Green Party, and we're going to explain that if the Democrats aren't further enough to the left for you, maybe you'd be more interested in the Green Party. Maybe they're more progressive or more to the left than the Democrats. So we said middle class tends to be much more Democrat. Working class blue collar tends to be much more Democrat, especially if it's unionized labor. So blue collar means like the shirt is literally blue because it could get dirty, or they do a job where it gets their clothes get dirty, so they wear blue shirts. Where white collar is you have a white dress shirt, so you're like a business worker or someone in a job that doesn't their clothes doesn't get dirty. You have the lower class tend to be much more Democrat. They tend to want services from the government and governmental support, and also the fact that they push for a $15 minimum wage, or they pull for higher wages and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these programs that support those in need tend to make lower class be much more democratic. Academia, college professors, academics tend to be a little bit more on the left. Universities, one thing you might want to consider is, and a lot of professors will be open about their bias if they're more of to the left or to the right when they talk in their courses, because when you get to college, they see you as an adult, and that's a conversation that could be had. Probably a lot of them are retracting from that a little bit more now because of the division. But there are conservative universities like Liberty University, which is a very conservative Christian university, and there's very progressive universities. Uh, Something like a University of San Francisco or something. Even in St. Louis, you'll see like Webster University is very, very progressive, where Missouri Baptist or Lindenwood might be a little bit more conservative. So you've got unions. Remember, a lot of union associations really push on they want workers' rights, and you can see the picture, and they want equal treatment for labor laws. They want raises to go up. They want minimum wage to go up. They want their pensions protected. Teachers tend to be in unions. Police officers are the ones that kind of stand out. They can be Democrat, but they also could be much more law and order, which is more Republican. Majority female, something around 65-70% of the Democrats are female versus only 30-35% are male. African Americans are probably the biggest supporters of Democrats. Over 90% of African Americans consistently vote Democrat. They're their biggest supporters. They have a very powerful pool in the party. I think some people would argue they make or break who's going to be running for president or so forth and so on, because they're so influential. They have what's called a Black Caucus, which there's so many African Americans that are representatives from across America that are black, that they actually work together in the Democrats as a block that can push on the Democrat Party and shift things to go one way or another. And you can see, like, even District 1 in St. Louis, we've had Lacey Clay for many years, African American. After his father was Bill Clay, who was a civil rights leader in St. Louis, was African American. Now we have Cori Bush, an African American woman and nurse, who's now our representative in District 1. So you can see the power there. Minorities, people of color, there's one minority that we'll get into with the Republicans that it tends to be very much more Republican, and that's really Cuban Americans. But outside of Cuban Americans, and we'll go into why, the Latinx, all these groups, immigrants tend to be much more Democrat. They tend to be much more open to immigration and refugees and supportive of Americans or people coming to America for a better life. They tend to be much more progressive, meaning they're focused on the future. So I said that teachers unions tend to support the Democrats. Well, that makes sense, because if they're focused on the future, that's what education is about. And then socially liberal. And we talked about socially liberal is. Socially liberal is things like they're against the death penalty, they're pro-choice. But again, you could be socially liberal and you could be a Republican. Like we said, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California. He was socially liberal, but he was conservative fiscally with government spending. So he was a Republican. That meant more to him. But he didn't believe, or he was pro-choice, for example. All right. So I'm just going to do a comparison. Here's the 116th members of Congress, the Democratic Party. And if you look at the picture, you kind of notice that the Democrats tend to be very diverse. It's actually, I would argue, becoming more diverse. There's a lot more women Democrats that are representatives in this Congress. There's a lot more people of color. We had some of the first Muslim. You can see there's Omar. She's one of the few Muslim representatives. She's a Democrat out of Minnesota. You got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's very far to the left. People would say she's a socialist Democrat or Democratic socialist. There's only a few, her and Bernie Sanders, and now Cory Bush are that are to the far left of the party, and that's a block in the Democrats as well. As Social Democrats are the real strong progressive liberal group, which pushes the party more to the left. And then you have moderates. You're going to have people like Joe Manchin, who's a senator from West Virginia, who's more of a blue dog Democrat. He tends to be more pro-life and fiscally conservative, but he's a Democrat. Okay, this is the 116th. These are the Republicans. They didn't do as well, and you can see that there's not as much diversity in the party. It's almost exclusively male. The party and the representatives are tended to be more male, older males too. There's one woman. The actually number of Republican women in Congress is reducing, while the number of Democratic women is increasing. So Carol Miller was the only Republican woman from West Virginia. These are all white males, and even the names kind of tell you their heritage. You've got Stube, Spano, Waltz, Armstrong, very English names. There is a Gonzalez, Hearn. So you can see there's a lot more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, probably. White meaning Anglo-Saxon, meaning like English and German heritage. Protestant, their religion. So, which is the majority. Americans are Protestant today, as opposed to Catholics. Like Joe Biden being the second Catholic Democratic president. All right, so let's look at some shifts and trends and patterns. What's happened with the Democrats and the Republicans? Well, if we look at this, so the top dot, and we got to look at these charts. You see the far right, it says 2014, okay? So the Republicans on the far right had a 30 plus, about 32% plus lead on white men. 32%, so about, was it 82% of white men that vote tend to vote more Republican, okay? Or it's 30% more. I'm sorry, it's increased. So you look at this, and white women tend to be more on like the 14th percentile, more vote Republican, okay? So what happened with the election of Donald Trump is he actually, it looks like from 2014 to 2016, he might have had an impact where more white women started going Democrat. You can see the shift, not much though. White women stayed pretty Republican at 61%, but they did lose a percentage for the Republicans. And then actually Donald Trump moved white males and did better in 2016, got more white males to vote Republican. Possibly. That could be one of the causes of the presidency. And usually presidential elections are very important. Then what happened in 2018, this is interesting. The opposite happened. White men stop voting more Republican and actually start moving down. There's still a majority at 22% more white men vote Republican, but that's a big difference between 32%. So something happened in 2018. Like, I guess maybe they didn't like the policies of the Republicans and Donald Trump. I don't know. And then you can see this. White women have shifted from 62% voting Republican to 50%. Now, 50% of white women vote Republican and 50% vote Democrat. That's a huge shift in 2018. And that really scared or alerted the Republicans. Let's look at the Democratic side. This is interesting. Black men in 2014 were about 74% of them were voting Democrat. And then they shifted. They actually started voting less Democrat in 2016 when Donald Trump ran. More black men voted Republican, probably for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump did better with African-American men. He might have got something around 10% of African-American men to vote his way. That's interesting. And then you look at black women, they became more Democrat in 2016 when Donald Trump came, more black women went up and started voting Democrat to 90% of black women voting Democrat. And that actually came back a little bit in 2018. And this is really interesting. By 2018, though, black men went the opposite way. They completely ran Democrat almost to 80%. And any gains that the Republicans got in 2016, they lost. So something happened in the next 2 years that really turned off black males. Latinx or Latino women are at a plus 33% Democrat. They, with Donald Trump, did not do well with them at all, and they moved over to 40% more voting Democrat. And then by 2018, they're at 50% more voting Democrat. Okay, and then you look at Latinx men. Well, only 58% of them in 2014 were voting Democrat. That shifted big. They went up to almost 80% of Latinx men voting Democrat. And then finally, if you go all the way down, and I know this is an interesting chart, and we got to look at all different types of graphs, they swung almost dead to 80%. So Latinx has become more Democrat in this 4-year gap, and white men have become a little bit more Republican, and then everybody starts shifting a little bit more on the Democratic side. So something's going on. Okay. Now this is a really good graph of showing us over time. I really like looking at this graph because we're looking at 1982 all the way up to 2018. And this is good data. So we're looking at 1982, almost everybody was, like, the Democrats had a killer lead. Killer lead. Most Americans were Democrats. Then something happened in 84. Boop, and the Republicans start doing much better with men. So I don't know what it is. We're going to talk about media and maybe information and how information is presented. We'll talk about the beginning of conservative talk show hosts and stuff. That was just starting to come. We'll see. But then it shifted back to Democrat again. And look at this. This just blows my mind. 1990 to 1992, from 92 to 94, men went from Democrat to Republican in 1992. That is a huge year for men to become Republicans all of a sudden. So I'm thinking historically, and we're going to talk about it in class, there was Newt Gingrich really rose to power in the Republicans in the late 80s using CNN. And then also there was a guy that just passed away, Rush Limbaugh, who became kind of the voice for conservative talk show radio. And he started up in the early 90s. And Fox News starts to come later. And you see this huge shift. And you have to wonder, did media do a really good job, conservative media, of moving Republican or Democratic men, especially, to the Republican side? Some arguments might have been they really pushed the Second Amendment and guns. Has that really moved men? Like, oh, they're going to take away our guns. Our gun rights are really a big motivator for males, especially white males. But they did a huge shift in 1994. This is a triumph for the Republicans. And then they start losing their lead again. And you can see Fox News is taken off around that time too, which is a whole conservative channel of media, which is an interesting concept. That you have an entire channel dedicated with a bias towards conservative media. And they use this argument that, well, all media was liberal, which that's kind of an interesting argument because you do have what are called op-ed, where you have conservative writers and liberal writers in papers. But we're going to look at ratings of papers. Can you rate papers and news and media outlets to see how conservative or progressive they are? And we're going to look at allsides.com and start looking at that. And you can see these it goes back and forth. The Republicans start falling apart a little. But then they go back up in 2002, especially after 9/11, or 2001, they just take off a little. And then, whoop, they drop. Barack Obama comes into play in 2008, and you can see that. And even men, they shift over to the Democrats. So maybe Barack Obama and the Great Recession, maybe they were blaming the Great Recession on the Republicans to some degree. Maybe Barack Obama's a really great candidate. I don't know. There's a lot of possible causes. And then in 2010, they shift big time, go back to being Republican. Men go back to being Republican. Women start to come over a little bit Republican in 2010 too, which is interesting to me. 2008, everybody was going for Barack Obama. Within 2 years, they turned against the Democrats, which is very interesting. And then finally, you see another shift. And everything moves more to the progressive side in the end, or the conservative side. Of the men start moving much more. By 2018, we're becoming much more on the Democrat side again. Now let's think about the geography of the Democrats. Where do they do well? Well, the urban or cities. Democrats tend to do much better in urban and city areas. Northeastern states, you can see the blue represents the Democrats, like New York is solid Democrat, Massachusetts is definitely Democrat. St. Louis City and County are very Democrat, but then other parts of Missouri are not very Democrat. Kansas City and Kansas City County are very Democrat, other parts not. And then also Columbia is a stronghold for Democrats with the University of Missouri. Now, Northwestern states in California, very progressive, tend to be very Democrat. Washington, Oregon, California, that Pacific West Coast tends to be very Democrat with the Northwest. New Mexico has been pretty consistent Democrat. And then you see the Great Lakes, and they call that the Blue Belt, where it's like this invincible wall. That Michigan, very unionized. A lot of car workers, a lot of pro-union Michigan people tend to be Democrat. Wisconsin used to be very Democrat. Minnesota tends to be a pretty progressive Democrat state. That's kind of the blue wall over there by you see Lake Michigan and Huron and all over that area. Now, and we'll talk about later with the other side, you can see the South and the mountain states tend to be very, very Republican. Now, what's strange is you got to be a metropolis. If you look at this map, though, you think the Democrats never win. Right. If you're looking at this map the wrong way, you would be like, oh, great. The Republicans they should be destroying the Democrats all the time. Yeah, but look at the number of representative votes or electoral college votes they have. Wyoming's got 3 votes. Wow. I mean, Wyoming's huge. It has 500,000 people, though. And you see all these Republican states they're like Texas is a huge space, but it's not as populated as California. It's got 32 electoral votes, where California has 54. That's almost twice as much, or 40% more. And you can see Hawaii tends to be Democrat, where Alaska tends to be Republican. And the new 2 states that they're talking about adding is maybe Puerto Rico being an actual state. Right now it's a Commonwealth. You can just go there. It's part of America. Or D.C., the District of Columbia. That would give the Democrats 4 more seats probably in the Senate, and then at least 1 more seat each, if not 2 in Puerto Rico in the House of Representatives. That would really help them. The Republicans do not like that idea. So let's go to the Green Party in 1991. So the Green Party in America, it's actually a German party. The Green Party is a relatively powerful party in Germany, but it hits the ground in America in 1991. So it's not a very old party. You can see that they're very socially justice. Their symbol's kind of flower in the environment. The guy on the right, his name is Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader is very progressive, very well respected. The man has something like 6 PhDs. I actually saw him speak when he was running for president. Interesting guy. One of the biggest criticisms they had of him in 2000 when he was running for president is that he wore $200 suits, or like $150 suits you'd buy at like a JCPenney's or a Sears or Famous Bar, if you guys know what that is, or like a cheaper store, like a Marshall's. He'd get these cheap suits because he doesn't really care. He's not the hippest dresser on the block. Very intellectual. The guy actually lives at his office, but he's actually a consumer advocate. Like what he does is he does research on products to make sure people are safe. He's famous for finding out that how dangerous things are without seatbelts. He pushed the government to make sure that seatbelts are mandatory to keep people safe, things like that. And he also pointed out like the Ford Pinto was exploding because the fuselage was in the back of the car. And when people, again, a fender bender, they'd hit the back of the car and blow up and burn people alive. And he really used science and his intellectual ability to advocate to protect Americans. So he's respected. However, he's very academic, very academia. So when he speaks, he talks like a professor. He's not very emotional or jumping around with the arms and flaring and getting people. He doesn't really speak to people's emotions or their pathos. He talks more to their logos, their logic. Like, this is what we should do. Very logical. And he was the leader of the Green Party for quite a while. And he's still behind the scenes. But there's other candidates like Jill Stein that have run since. Now, and he lost, obviously, the 2000 election against Al Gore and George Bush. And a lot of people blame Ralph Nader because they say that Al Gore would have won the 2000 election if Ralph Nader didn't run, because Ralph Nader took Al Gore's votes, is the argument. And that's one of the arguments against voting against a third party. because Florida, for example, was only won by 550 votes by George Bush, and it's pretty certain that Ralph Nader had not run, at least 550, if not millions of people more would have, or hundreds of thousands of people more would have voted for um, Al Gore, and he would have been president over George Bush. And then people would be like, well, see, we would have never been in Afghanistan or Iraq, and we would have handled things different. So anyway, so their ideas are very similar to Democrats. Governments must regulate business for citizens' sakes, but they think the Democrats don't go further enough. They're actually very similar to social democrats, but they're much more. They want a progressive tax where the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay, like the Democrats and the social Democrats we talked about that are in the party. They're very grassroots democracy, which means like Ralph Nader, when he was running, for example, he didn't take any money from PACs or personal for companies. It's all personal donations. They're very much into feminism. Remember, feminism just means men and women are 100% equal, and gender equality, respect for diversity. They're kind of ahead of their time there. The Democrats have, in some ways, adopted some of their ideas and to become even more feminist and more LGBTQ friendly today than they were at the time. The Green Party with Nader, remember, gay marriage wasn't necessarily a big issue in 2000. Now it's done, but it was a defining issue for the Democrats in the end. Very much focused on sustainability. They have a building that's actually on renewable energy. They're very pro public taxing. They're very concentrated in the environment. This Green New Deal stuff that's coming out of the social democrats, the far left of the Democrats today, very much inspired in some ways by the Green Party. And they're the same way in Germany and other countries where they're probably very much about the environment and a renewable energy future. Meat consumption, things we could do to make the environment better. I think he's a vegetarian or vegan. Medicaid, Medicare, he wants universal health care for everybody. They would say Medicaid and Medicare are great, Social Security, but we need universal health care. And the Democrats just do not take it far enough. And you're going to see the Green Party have won some office positions, especially in like cities where the Democrats are just not progressive enough. In St. Louis, the Green Party almost always runs against the Democrats. They tend to do better than the Republicans in St. Louis City because it's so progressive. So that's a new party, and looking at the demographics for